This short video describes how to create a scatter plot in Excel. A scatter plot is a graph that shows the response on two variables as a single point for each participant. They're really good for showing correlations. For example, here's a scatter plot showing cumulative GPA on the y-axis and average number of hours of sleep per night on the x-axis. So this individual right here has a GPA of 2.0 and gets about 7 hours of sleep a night. Let's create a scatter plot with an imaginary experiment where we evaluate somebody's stress per Let's create a scatter plot with an imaginary experiment. Let's create a scatter plot with an imaginary experiment looking at a person. Let's create a scatter plot with an imaginary experiment where we evaluate two variables of some participants. We look at their stress using the perceived stress scale, and we ask them to estimate the number of hours that they exercise per week. Let's create a scatter plot with an imaginary experiment where we evaluate two variables for a group of participants. We have them take the perceived stress scale, which measures stress, and we have them estimate the number of hours that they estimate. Let's create a scatter plot with an imaginary experiment where we evaluate two variables. One, we have our participants take the perceived stress scale, which measures stress, and we also have them keep a close record of the number of hours that they exercise per week. The perceived stress scale asks many questions, and people answer on a Likert scale from 0, never, all the way up to 4, very often, to several of these statements. In the last month, how often have you been able to control irrational The perceived stress scale asks many The perceived stress scale has several statements, and people respond on a scale from 0, never, to 4, very often. In the last month, how often have you felt nervous and stressed? That's question number 3. And then you add up all the scores, and you get a range of stress. So over here we have the variable of exercise hours that people evaluate. We have here all the 30 participants, And here we have the stress score. And here's the range of the stress score. So, for example, participant number 1 has a stress score of 22 and exercises 2.5 hours per week. Creating a scatter plot is rather easy. You just highlight the data, come over to Insert, choose the scatter plot, and you produce this very nice scatter plot. All right. Now I'm going to get rid of the title, but of course I need to add my axes labels. So my y-axis is my the hours of exercise per week, and the x-axis is my perceived stress scale score. Okay, so here's an individual who has a perceived stress scale of 10 and also exercises 10 hours a week. That's an individual. Now I'm going to change a few things to make this look a little better, like I like to do. Double click, go over here to align, make a nice solid black line on both the axes. I just think it looks nicer. My font is a little small, so I'm going to come up here and I'm going to change the font to 12. And again, you can keep these grid lines in. I think they look fine. I just tend to get rid of them. Click on them, press delete. Now I'm going to show you something else that I think does I'm going to show you something else that's very informative. I'm going to click on the data. Now I'm going to change the look of the graph a little bit. I think blue circles look fine, but let's see how we can change them. Click on them, come over to this fill line, change marker. Now we can change the marker to a different shape, such as little X's, or let's do squares. I can even make them a little bigger, and I can change how they look. I'm going to change them to fill in. I'm not going to do blue. Let's do orange. And the border is black, and that looks like a nice scatter plot. Now if I double click on this, finally, I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to add trend line. Trend lines can be very informative. And a trend line creates a line of best fit through all of the scatter plot points. Another thing that I can do that can be very informative to people looking at the graph is I can add an equation, which is just a linear function, and an r squared value. Let's look at what that represents. Y equals, this number is the slope. A slope is the degree to which the slope is the steepness of this line. And this number here, 6.6, is where this line would cross the y-axis. This is just a linear function equation. R squared is a value that if you took the square root of r squared and just got r, that would be a Pearson R correlation value. So somebody can look at the strength of the correlation just by this equation without doing the statistics, although the statistics would be needed to support your conclusions. So let's take our graph, copy it, bring it into our assignment, paste, and there's our pretty graph. Now I can also change the size of the graph. I can just pull it in. Maybe I don't want such a giant graph. That looks nice. If you get it into a document and you just paste it normally without pasting the picture, you can still change it. So look, when we made it smaller, we might have to make the fonts a little different. We could also change the scatter plot points if we want. Now the question is, what correlation does this graph represent? Because the slope is negative, see the negative? That implies it's a negative correlation. In other words, as exercise goes up, stress comes down. It's a negative correlation. As one value goes up, the other comes down. And this is something that we actually find to be true. Exercise is a great coping mechanism for stress. So this is a negative correlation. That's a scatter plot.